Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to the BSC HDR panel, The Good, the Bad and the Beautiful. During today's seminar, we'll be discussing the brave new world of high dynamic range imagery and the consequences to cinematography of its application. But first, by way of an apology, when we HDR display technology is in its infancy, and when we started to plan the panel, we were hoping that we'd be able to project true HDR onto our big screen behind us, but unfortunately this hasn't worked out for various reasons. We do, however, have been fortunate to obtain two high-end panels from Panasonic and Sony, so that during the session we can show various images in both SDR and HDR color space. You'll see the difference even from the back, hopefully, and we'll be describing the differences that you see as you're watching them as well. So to continue, in the field of cinematography, the challenge of the new has always been par for the course, and technological developments in all areas continue unabated. Some, like Super 16, were driven by cinematographers in pursuit of image quality on smaller, quieter and more cost-effective cameras. And I'd argue that the development of digital cinema cameras came to us largely through the camera manufacturers themselves. And is very apparent at this weekend's Expo. This continues to evolve with ever higher pixel count, sensitivity and dynamic range. So HDR displays have already found quite wide acceptance, a development that's not really been driven by cinematographers or camera manufacturers, but by the manufacturers of display devices led primarily by Dolby. To those who've not come across HDR imagery before, HDR display means that the images from existing cameras, both film and digital based, can be set to display on certain screens and display devices with brighter highlights and darker shadows. And this, coupled with new color science, provides a new and exciting interpretation of the image, utilizing less compression of existing camera film stock dynamic range. Early on in HDR's infancy, it seemed to some cinematographers that the sheer brightness of specular highlights would end up distorting and unbalance the tonal aspects of composition. But it seems that with careful application on set and in the grade, this does not have to be the case, and it's what we'll be talking about today. In fact, as Tony and I will be talking about later, HDR display can be seen as a powerful tool to further express the cinematographer's intent. So anyway, enough from me. I'll now hand over to colorist and color consultant Kevin Shaw to give us a short presentation on HDR, and then it'll be opened out to the rest of the panelists for comments and experiences before reaching out to questions from you guys at the end. So at the end of the table we have Kevin Shaw, colorist. Sat next to him is Thomas Urbye, a colorist from the Look. Tony Miller, BSC, Christopher Ross, BSC, myself, and on my right-hand side is Ian Lowe from Dolby. So welcome to the panel, and over to you, Kevin.
Thanks very much. So it's an honor to be here, and it's quite exciting to talk about HDR. I've been working in HDR, first HDR job was about 2 years ago now, and as Chris said, it's disappointing that we haven't been able to get HDR images on the big screen, but it's fairly typical because there are a lot of misunderstandings about what HDR is and what it does to the pictures. So I've just put together a few slides to explain what it is and what it isn't. Things that it's not. It's not what we used to call HDR. That's the first confusion. So in the past, you'd get people in Photoshop, multiple exposures, splice them together. You get these kind of weird metallic-looking images, which was known forever as HDR. This is nothing to do with that. In fact, technically you don't need to do anything different in the capture stage. A lot of cameramen will tell you that they've always captured HDR. In other words, they've always captured more range, more dynamic range than the standard television can show you. So we're not talking about that, and to distinguish from that, we now like to refer to that Photoshop technique as either photo HDR or HDR imaging. One of the problems we had in setting this up was, this projector that we have here is incredibly bright. It's running, I think, at about 10% of its correct brightness. And so we can easily make that projector brighter. Just making the images brighter doesn't give you HDR. And we use the term high dynamic range, but originally the term was extended dynamic range. And if we think of it that way, that's perhaps a more honest approach to what we're trying to achieve here. It's not a color space. So we had monitor settings that said Rec 2020, and there's an assumption that as soon as you choose 2020, you've got HDR. HDR actually doesn't require any increase in color space. You could have HDR and a Rec 709 triangle. That doesn't mean that you don't have more colors. You do have a lot more colors, but the color comes from the brightness, not from the triangle that you see on the chromaticity chart. Up until now, we've never really had to think about brightness because we accepted that everything had a standard brightness, which goes right back 50 years to the cathode ray tube, the CRTs. And so a lot of our current display technology is built around the physical characteristics of CRTs that we haven't used in 20 years. And so that brings us to gamma as well. The other interesting thing about 2020, which I'll just mention, is that we don't master in 2020 because there are no displays or projectors, for that matter, that can do 100% 2020. So even when you get a consumer display that says 2020, we physically limit. Think of it as a sort of in the old days, we'd had broadcast legalization. So the legalization currently for HDR and premium, ultra premium, UHD premium, is that we grade to P3 space because that's what we can calibrate to. When you switch to 2020, it's a bigger triangle, but the only thing you will normally see is an increase in saturation. It's not limited to 4K, so it's perfectly acceptable to have HDR HD. The association between 4K and 2020 and HDR is largely from the display manufacturers, the UHD Alliance, to come up with a single format that embraces all of these different technologies. But it doesn't need 4K either. In fact, all of the material that we show here today is HD, HDR. Unfortunately, there's not one standard. There are many, many standards. But when it comes down to shooting and post-producing, then it's much simpler. There are really only two routes to go with HDR in the mastering stage, and that is HLG or perceptual quantization. And in my presentation, I'm focusing mainly on PQ, which is BT 2084, which is a new EOTF. It replaces gamma, basically. And for me, if you don't have that EOTF, you can have more color and you can have brighter displays, but you don't have extended dynamic range. And so after the slides, I'm going to switch over to these monitors to demonstrate just how different working with perceptual quantization is to the conventional way of working. There is a belief by some that, well, I don't have to bother with HDR because it's going to go away. It's just another fad. It's just like stereo and many fads that have been before that. And I personally don't believe that. And I would say to you that it's much closer to, say, the technology of going from CRTs to flat screens. Why did we get flat screens? At the time, none of us thought flat screens were better. We had huge problems. Tom and myself and a number of colleagues hung on to our CRTs for quite some time because we couldn't trust the calibration of the LCDs. So why did we make the change? Well, because there was absolutely no chance of building laptops with CRTs in the back of them. You would have been carrying a huge suitcase around with you just to get mobile computing. So the technology came because of much wider markets than ours. And the same is true with 4K, and the same is true with HDR. The reason that HDR technology is being embraced by the likes of Apple and LG and Samsung and all the other manufacturers is largely to do with tablets and mobile phone technology. The one thing that tablets and mobile phones don't do really well right now is they're not very legible in bright, sunny exterior environments. And if you want to be able to read a phone in a sunny or a light environment, you need more brightness off of the screen. And manufacturers typically don't like to be manufacturing multiple versions of things. They like one size fits all. And so they're going to produce brighter screens, whether we like it or not. And the research from Dolby and others, but pioneered by Dolby, has shown that the current way that we work with gamma falls flat very quickly after about 200 or 300 nits. And so that's just really not bright enough. So what is HDR? What really defines HDR? The one thing that you need to see HDR is an HDR display. If you don't have an HDR display, it's pointless talking about it or comparing it or even theorizing about it, because until you see it, it's very hard to get your head around. There are a growing number of professional displays. Up until earlier this year, the only display that you could, there were only probably 2 or 3 displays that you could buy to do professional grading with. And those were the Sony X300, Canon, and Atomos had one for on-set use. This year we're seeing those numbers increase dramatically from the likes of Flanders Scientific and ESO and others, where they're building in HDR. And what distinguishes a professional display from the consumer displays that you can already buy, because after all there's an awful lot of colorists that are calibrating consumer televisions nowadays and grading with those. The difference with HDR, as we've found to our cost here at the Expo, is that the vast majority of consumer devices, whether they're projectors or television displays, will only switch to HDR when they receive an HDR flag. And that means that you can't physically put the remote on the screen and say, I want you to show me this as an HDR playback. Now that's a mixed blessing. It makes it very difficult for us to set up demonstrations and to do grading. But think of it this way. The reason that is attractive is that for the first time, a consumer, without having to know anything about how the remote control works or do anything else, can put in a Blu-ray disc or stream from Netflix or Amazon, and the television itself will say, oh, this is HDR. It'll switch over, little badge comes up in the top right-hand corner, and you're automatically watching HDR. And if you take that one step further to the Dolby Vision license, then Dolby Vision licensed televisions have a chip, have firmware in them that not only switches it to Dolby Vision, but also has no allowance for, let's say, manufacturer input. In other words, for the first time, what we master on and what the consumer sees with no intervention from the consumer will be as close as possible, given the realms of the technology and power saving and so the rest. So certainly for myself as a colorist, and I'm sure all of us here, that's really exciting, because for the first time there's a very good chance that people will be able to see images the way that they were created without the consumer having to know how to make that happen. Where are we 2 years into the rollout of HDR? Seems amazing, really, that it has been 2 years already. Well, in 2016, Amazon and Netflix really sort of took the flag to run with it, and they realized that this was a way of giving themselves sort of a unique selling point over traditional broadcasters. And sure enough, we started to see a very steady movement away from traditional broadcasting. So much so that the broadcasters are now having to concentrate on online players to be able to meet this market. YouTube accepting, even in 2016, YouTube were accepting HDR downloads. The BBC were publicly demonstrating Planet Earth and so on. Last year, we saw an increasing number of consumer sets supporting it, games machines, Xbox and so on, telephones, all supporting HDR. And towards the end of last year, both Microsoft and Apple have adopted HDR into their operating systems as well. It's early in 2018. I think perhaps the most exciting thing I've seen so far this year is that at the Consumer Electronics Show, Sony rolled out a prototype television capable of 10,000 nits and 8K resolution. 10,000 nits is the theoretical maximum of the PQ curve, and honestly, I never thought I'd ever see a display put that out. So for that to hit the stands so early on is also quite an interesting technology. The most common format of HD in terms of consumer electronics is going to be UHD Premium, which is a standard put together by the UHD Alliance, who are largely manufacturers. And so what they've done is they've tied together 4K resolution, 10-bit minimum bit depth, the wide color gamut, so using 2020 as the color space, and high dynamic range. They've tied all of those together to call it UHD Premium, which has led to a lot of the confusion about what HDR is. HDR doesn't need any of these other things, but it's packaged together that way. And then just before I move into the demonstration part, let's try and think of HDR not as I say, brighter or more colorful pictures, but going back to a very simple zone system approach to filming. If SDR is capable of 11 stops from 0 to 10, 11 steps from 0 to 10, then what we don't want to do, and I think all colorists try this the first time that they sit in front of an HDR monitor, reach for the gain, bring the whites up. Doesn't work for the same reason that we can't stick with gamma. If you just make the pictures brighter, then you haven't in fact got an extended dynamic range. What we're really trying to do is add more steps after the white. So if you think of what I call paper white, so if I look at this, my name tag at the front here, that's going to stay at 100 nits. That doesn't have to go any brighter, even in an HDR curve. And now we've got all this headroom from 100 to theoretically 10,000 nits, where we can do the highlights on the bottle and the brightness of a screen and things like that. And we're going to talk a lot today about how that changes the aesthetics of viewing. The point I'm going to make in the demonstration here is that there's a fundamental difference between working in HDR and working in SDR. It's quite common today to start off with the SDR grade and then do a trim pass to get to HDR. But in fact, you can imagine that if you select a look in SDR that is quite flat, that's not really going to translate without altering the artistic intent. And it makes sense that we start with HDR and move back to SDR, but we're not quite there yet in terms of productions, producing, and logistics. So what's the main difference? It's to do with the gamma. So when we're working in SDR, whether it's television or cinema, digital cinema, we're working with gamma, and we grade black at 0 and white at 1023, and we don't really care too much about the display device. If the projector is a little bit brighter, or the TV is a little bit brighter, or a little bit darker for that matter, then the television, the display, stretches the image. And the image is brighter, and the things that are white are now a brighter white, and the things that were black are a darker black. But we haven't increased the number of stops on the screen. When we work with perceptual quantization, the code value that we create in the grading is an absolute light output. So if I grade something to be 1,000 nits, then only a 1,000 nit monitor can display it. If I put it on a 600 nit monitor, everything above 600 nits is just clipped. Now, obviously that is going to cause a problem, and so to compensate for that, we also create metadata, be it static or dynamic. We create metadata that sends a little message to the TV and says, this is mastered at 1,000 nits, you're only 600 nits, you're going to have to do a little bit of tone mapping to make it look correct on your screen. That's a little bit of magic that works so that we create one master and you can play it back on any device. So for example, the the two screens I have here, the one on the left is set up currently as a Rec 709, and the one on the right is set up for 2084 PQ with all of the ultra UHD trappings with it. They're not perfectly calibrated, and I apologize for that. We just ran out of time in making this work. But what you will see is that the PQ curve significantly changes the way that we look at images. It also changes the way that we monitor images. So this is a scene that I have, a clip that I have here in the demonstration. And you'll see that it uses the full range from 0 to 1023. This is graded for digital cinema presentation, and that's what my scopes would look like. If we look at the same image graded for a 1000 nit display, you can see that nothing goes above the about 75% of the code values, because if it did, it would clip on a 1000 nit display. So let's put that into practice. If we could just shut that projector off for a little bit. I'm going to switch over to Resolve. Starting off here with Kodak LAD. So this is a Cineon log image on a Rec 709 screen. I'm sure we've all seen log images on a screen, and we're familiar with that sort of flat look. And what I have on my timeline are a number of images. This one I just showed you, for example. This is coming camera raw into the color corrector. And so the first thing that a colorist normally has to do is, and I can't really see what's going on here, so I'm working blind, but we might drop the blacks, we might add some contrast to the image, and pretty quickly we're going to get something that looks more or less how it should. The point about this is that that is an artistic interpretation of what comes out of the camera. And there are limitations. So, for example, the sky and the highlights you'll see here, they, although they're clearly very different in terms of light values in real life, in the 709 world, they're both approaching maximum and they get compressed together. There are other complications. So in this example, for example, again, I'm just going to wind up the contrast. And what you'll see with this clip is that clearly this girl's dress is all pink. It's not pink with white stripes or anything like that. But what's happening here is that the limitations of brightness are limiting colors in the highlight areas of the dress. So the only way for me to get that dress back to purple would be really to bring the brightness down to a very low level. So the limitations of the RGB system, where your peak light output comes from equal amounts of red, green, and blue, mean that we have to roll off the colors in 709 space. I'm going to put this image as well up just for a second. This is an interesting image because, as you can see in the 709 world, it's going to need quite a lot of work, partly because even when I add all the contrast into it, it's not a very interesting image. But when we put it into the high dynamic range world, that particular image barely needs any grading whatsoever. A couple more shots to look at. This one of the elephants, for example. This elephant has a water reflection on its back, and the reflection of that in real life is significantly brighter than what I call paper white, but it still has nowhere to go. So it has this kind of flat, limited look about it. Another shot, this one. Let's put some gamma and drop the blacks in it. The interesting thing on this shot is the lens flare and the backlight of the clouds. Again, the backlight of the clouds, unless I'm prepared to clip it, is going to limit the overall brightness of the scene. And one last image that I'll put up. Let's add some contrast in there. In order to get good contrast in the Rec 709 world with only 100 nits, then we really need to use the full range of the image. Now, there's a lot of detail inside that tree trunk, but in 709, if I try to just lift the levels overall, and I know we can do shapes and windows and all the rest of it, But you'll see as soon as I try to lift the blacks up to see more detail into that tree trunk, my image goes flat because I now don't have enough dynamic range to work with. If we can turn the other monitor on now, and I'll go back to Kodak LAD. So the setup here is I'm sending the same image to both screens. The only difference between the two screens is one is set to 709 and the other one is set to PQ. So this is an ungraded Kodak LAD, and you can see as soon as I put it on the PQ screen, actually it really doesn't need grading. I can, if I want to, I can go in and pull down the highlights. If I'm looking, as I'm looking at this on the scope, I can see that there is an area of the image that goes above 1,000 nits. And so in the grading, I can then pull that back if I want to. So we should start to see the hair detail come back in as I wind that down. But actually, most of the image, everything up to the maximum of that display, looks as it should coming out of the camera. Let's go back and look at some of the other shots that we looked at. So we'll work backwards. So I'm going to just disable the grade. So with no grading, you can see how close the right-hand image is. So for the first time, using HDR monitors and using this idea of the perceptual quantization curve, for the first time, we can see something very, very close to what's coming out of the camera. We don't require colorist intervention to simply get the correct gamma, get the correct EOTF, and to guess at what the cameraman was trying to do. People then ask me, well, so how long does it take to grade HDR if it starts so close to where you need it to be? I think everybody on the panel will attest to the fact there's an enormous amount of fiddling that goes on trying to manage the highlights. Because now things that automatically rolled off in 709 can suddenly become very, very distracting. In this image, for example, I'm guessing at what this screen output is, but I think it's around 600 or 700 nits. But if you see that on a 2000 nit screen, that sky is blindingly bright. And so that needs to be managed in the HDR grade as we're going forwards. So I'm going to jump now to the graded timeline. As I say, it's not perfectly calibrated, but let's just play a few scenes from this particular documentary. This is a documentary that was done over a year ago and is now available on HDR disc. So this is something that is already out there. And we've tried to keep it as natural as possible, as close as possible to the camera footage. In fact, there's one or two scenes in there that don't go above 100 nits. So just because you have a brighter screen doesn't mean that images have to be brighter. So I'll just let that play for a little bit and hand you back to Chris.
So yeah, while you guys are watching that, I'd like to introduce Tony Miller, BSC, who's going to talk with about some first-hand experience that he's had with his last projects on in HDR. Over to you, Tony.
Hello, everybody. Well, you have to excuse me because I wrapped last night after 5 months in Prague. So this is a typical day with a hangover that I wouldn't want to be looking at an HDR monitor in a grading session. I'd need my sunglasses. So anyway, I thought I'd tell you about Carnival Row. It's an Amazon 8-part fantasy period noir with strong political white supremacy race overtones. And I thought I'd tell you about that and how I approached HDR with that. I think the first thing was that, you know, when I took on the job and Amazon said, well, you know all about HDR, you know, you're the technical guy. And I sort of went to the toilet and felt very worried because actually the problem with HDR is it's such a learning curve. And even though I've done 2 other shows, I really am a baby and there is so much I don't know. And often it's really scary. And you think as a cinematographer, if you've got some experience, you know what you're doing. HDR comes along and it wrecks your day. So one of the things I did was to shoot tests. Projects set around 1870, so there was lots of practical lights, there was lots of different source lighting, and one thing we found immediately was that in shooting the test was translights really didn't work very well. They don't have the contrast that a natural image would, and we found they looked very plasticky, and you couldn't really manipulate them very easily, and so translights we soon abandoned on this show. Another thing we found was that practical lights, I tested lots of different ones. We had lots of candles, we had oil lamps. In some of the oil lamps I'd put 3 bulbs to create a flicker. I soon found that those were, you could see the bulb, you could see the filament, and I think one thing I also learned was you just didn't need them, that the light source without any bulb in them looked much better with the original oil wick. And the same applied to candles. We learned from Wendy Watkins that it's great to burn windows out, and that's something I like to do. And I fight with HDR often because I want it to look the way I've lit it, and for period that tends to be pretty dark. I like exposing down in the low areas, and then if I want something to burn out, it's for a reason. And I think with HDR, I often struggle with that because the idea is you're going to keep everything within the range of the nits or the mice or the fleas or whatever they're called. But it's complex, and you look out the window you've burnt out, and then you can see there's a grip standing out there drinking coffee when you get to the HDR grade. So you've got to be really careful. I certainly haven't abandoned letting things blow out. And likewise, you put practicals in shots for reasons, and I want them to have the same emotional feeling that they do when I'm lighting for SDR. And often I'm finding in HDR, you've got to really manipulate those because suddenly they appear to be really bright. So there's a really massive learning curve. And I think, as Kevin said, let's not give up on it yet. Let's not, it is so malpracticed at the moment in terms of what you do with it. But as a practitioner, on having just done a $100 million show, I find it really, really tricky because it's just not clear what you do. And then, someone said to me, well, why don't you just have an HDR monitor on set? And, we'll give you another 3 guys and they can manage it. And you can go between your SDR and your HDR monitor. At which point my head's sort of exploding, thinking, this project's political enough already. I don't need 2 monitors and to be worrying about formats. My job is to, create looks, to create an emotional feel to this dark political drama in a way. And if I'm having to think technically all the time, that just really wrecks my day. And I flag that as a major problem at the moment that, has beset us as cinematographers before. And some producers just don't fully grasp that, we need one format. We need to light for one format. In the back of our minds, we may consider HDR, but it's very, very difficult to light with 2 formats in mind. Going down my tests, I had 2 scenes. One was a sewers scene where the Dark Asher baddie guy gets attacked by Orlando Bloom, our hero, and we decided we wanted to try and do this with a shotgun, and really you just want to see him for a flash. So we got a charge which we built so that the charge did lots of tests with the special effects guys that gave us a big flash, and the idea is we'd use that as a single source. And on the HDR test, it was amazing. I mean, I shot the tests at 90 frames on the Arri SXT, and the the charge on HDR was enough to expose the whole scene, and quite amazing, the dynamic range in the highlights, as Kevin's talked about. So that was one scene where HDR really functioned brilliantly as a lighting director of photography. Another scene was a library where Cara Delevingne rises with a torch, and again we wanted it to be single source, and on the ground the torch was fire. No problem, looks great, but in HDR we started to see the blue of the gas in the base of the torch, so we're going to have to recolor that. That's a VFX expensive paint out for HDR. But as she rose, we had an LED torch which took over where the VFX guys will create fire, and the dynamic range of HDR really allowed us to light that scene in a studio set that was probably as big as this with a single source, and that's an amazing thing to be able to do. To me, I think HDR is very much in infancy, and I've started to expose much darker. I find the Rec 7 and 9 on set in the back of my mind, knowing that this is going to go HDR, is becoming obsolete, because I find I'm always lighting into the shadows, knowing the Alexa will let me do that, and HDR will allow me to have more information really in the highlights. But apart from that, I think it just feels like these are early days, and if you ask me after 3 HDR films, do I know what I'm doing? I'm sorry, guys, I don't really know what I'm doing. So it is really a learning curve, and I think we did Fleabag with Thomas Urbye. One thing we learned from that, which I've also learned on this last job, is if your actors' eyeballs get bigger for whatever reason, late nights, cocaine, whatever, be careful, because you are going to see in those eyeballs your practical sources and anything that reflects. On Fleabag, we also noticed on the HDR that makeup became exacerbated, the areas of blemishes, and just working with the stunningly beautiful Cara Delevingne, we would be really careful around here for anything that could reflect, knowing that it would become exacerbated in the HDR grade. And that put quite a lot of pressure on the makeup team, who were already doing a fantastic job. I think the last thing before I pass on was just, working on a film where a fifth of the budget is going to be VFX. You've got to really factor in that as they put out the effects around the world to many vendors, that they're watching this on HDR monitors, and our brilliant VFX coordinator pointed out yesterday to me that actually not many of our vendors are doing this, and that creates a big problem which you don't want later on when you're putting it all together. I should pass you on to someone else here, but it's very exciting, but it does feel like early days.
I guess, so if I could pass on to Thomas Urbye, he's the colorist at the look that both Tony and I have worked with quite a few times. Maybe you guys could talk about your work together on Fleabag to start off with.
Well, in that example, we were focused very much on the SDR grade, because let's not forget this is 2 years ago. So it was very much this tomb landed in my inbox from Amazon about the specs they wanted. But the focus was very much SDR, so we graded that, and then I had to do a trim pass, which Kevin touched on, was fine, because it did kind of feel 2 years ago. It was, well, we're making some nice images here. This is, the HDR is going to look good. But as I said, the focus was very much the SDR. But what has happened, what the transition now, of course, is that, we're doing The Innocents, and that is a Dolby Vision project going directly to Netflix. And we will only be grading in essentially HDR until we then use the Dolby CMU box to do a trim pass. So Netflix actually only want from us an HDR deliverable. They don't want an SDR deliverable. They will use Dolby's technology to deliver that. So, I mean, we'll probably talk to Ian about a bit more about that. But there has been a big change. I think now we are probably going to be doing the HDR grade as the priority moving forward from this year onwards, I would think.
Yeah, I think it was interesting when we did Fleabag that it was all handheld. We shot it anamorphic with the cooks, but it wanted to have a really rough feel to it in a way. And we did have problems in the HDR with makeup, with skin blemishes. I mean, maybe you can talk about that, because that was one problem I think we both found difficult.
Yeah, I mean, I think we're obviously talking about HDR here, but I do think the expanded colour range that you can achieve in 2020 also introduces a potential rougeness to people's skin if makeup or actors have decided to do stuff on their faces themselves, or to, encourage makeup to do a particular thing. That becomes very obvious. I think the other thing is, Tony talked about lights and reflections in the eyes. This can be very time-consuming. I think we're on 4 days for the HDR grade on the Innocence, but yeah, you could end up trying to pull keys on things, and we're used to doing that for skies and taking individual colours down. But when you start getting into highlights, I think it's not just that as well. The thing to remember is big reflections. Those what you see on, and we would have this on Fleabag, is you've got lots of silver cars dotted around in the back of shot. And I think that's if anything hits those, what you suddenly have is a potential to be completely clipped out and very distracting. And in SDR, that didn't, it's not a problem. You just, you like it, it's fine. You key things down. If it's there on the Alexa, you've got all that information. But when you start going into an HDR pass and you have all these things that you otherwise would have been clipped out, and I'm not just talking about lighting, I'm talking about just anything in the background, it can become incredibly distracting. Some of the stuff we've seen, if you've got street lights and you've exposed up for everybody else because it's a night shoot or whatever, those lights could be completely clipped out and they're just blobs. And you would have done in SDR, you would have just blurred them, keyed them, everyone's sort of seen it, halate them slightly. In HDR, you could do it, but it's just a lot more of a faff because there's so much information there. So I think, there's a combination. I think the main point that Tony said as well on the Fleabag, what we really noticed is just reflections on gums, because they're slightly, they're moist. People's mouths are moist. So around the lip, when people are talking, I'll be getting a reflection on my lip here. All of that just starts to become very clear. Now, in the Fleabag grade, there wasn't the time to sit there and do it. And to be honest with you, it feels like there's a naturalism to that show. But that doesn't mean to say on certain shows you would have to say we need to fix this. And I would say that the HDR grading, regardless of the fact that when you apply the PQ curve, it makes log images look nice. You are going to be looking, I think, at a longer amount of time because of all the reflections.
And so, you touched on the Dolby pass that you'll be doing on the Innocence. So at this point, we should bring in Ian, who can tell us a little bit more about the not only the Dolby monitoring, the Dolby monitors that a lot of us have been working with, but also the Dolby Magic boxes.
Thank you. So I guess Dolby is part of the reason why this kind of thing has developed. We did a lot of research. We designed this PQ curve and gave it to SMPTE as our way of demonstrating HDR out there, and it's obviously been widely adopted. It's not an easy change for people to have. Certainly from a camera image perspective, if you take an ARRI log or an S log and you convert it to PQ, it pretty much is what you shot is what you see now on screen, good, bad, ugly, whichever way around. Now, again, I think a lot of the art of the DOP, working with light meters and exposure and everything, actually will produce some stunning results. As Kevin said, straight out of the camera, you get a very nice start point. And then obviously the colorists can do their work in stylizing that. I guess where the industry's been at for, let's say, the last 2-3 years in this move towards HDR is been very much everything's shot SDR or for SDR, and now we're reworking it into HDR. I think as we move forward, because a lot of those delivery schedules are we only want an HDR version with an SDR deliverable, we will start to see, as Tony said, a lot of those lessons being learnt, and maybe that HDR version that arrives for the colorist, understanding some of those things that are happening. From a Dolby perspective, our workflow is very much to do an HDR grade, and with our Magic Box, the CMU, we can map that down to a number of different deliverables. So we can move that down to the lowest common denominator of broadcast Rec 709 version. We could do an HDR10 version for Blu-ray, a number of options in there. The difference is there is one master grade, and then there are some trim grades. And those trim grades are, again, defined by whoever that content owner is as to what those trim grades do. They might take you a day, whatever, 2 days, depending on how long the program is. But once you've done that, the content owner gets a master grade and a kind of an adjusted version for television. So it can be a very, very efficient workflow. You don't end up with 3 or 4 different versions. You end up with one version with some instructions on how that's delivered. So if you take that with a Netflix show, you end up with an HDR version with Dolby Vision that if you have an LG or a Sony television, you watch that version at home. That's what Netflix delivers to you. If you don't have a Dolby Vision television and you just have a regular HDR one, something like a Samsung, it will deliver you an HDR10 version. And if you're like me, still with an old Rec 709 flat screen, again, I would just see a Rec 709 image. There's nothing happening apart from the clever people at Netflix taking that master file and applying it through their transcode devices. So you can see the attraction for a lot of the sort of content owners, one master with as many different versions as you want from that one original content. The important part is all of that is very much controlled. It's controlled by the colorist. It's signed off by the director. It's signed off the DP. So there is no magic happening without a creative input. This is all creative choices. And ideally, if you have it with Dolby Vision, you get the creative choices, as Kevin said, right the way through to the screen at home. So it really is a big change to where you can now control your content, what people see, right the way through to the home, which is, I think, a very exciting time.
Excellent, yeah, very much so. So I guess I've got to show my clip now. I'd love to speak about it a little bit before. So my first experience in shooting a project for high dynamic range output was a pilot for a series on Amazon called Oasis. And the story is set on a colony on a planet in another galaxy where the sun is unbearably hot, and the humans that go to inhabit this place have to hide away from it on a daily basis. So this sequence is the very first moment that our protagonist, played by Richard Madden, arrives on the planet after being in hypersleep for I don't know, a year, whatever. So yeah, that's. Okay, so yeah, Kevin, if you could play it on a loop, and then I'll just talk nonsense over the top of it, kind of thing. So the first thing to say is that it was graded at Molyneux, this amazing colorist called Asa Schul, and we had 4 days to deliver an SDR pass of the 1 hour show, and then 1 day to complete the HDR version. And so as all of the people that are sat at this panel can the 1 day is not quite enough to deal with all the fun stuff you can do with an HDR grade. What you guys don't really get the appreciation of in this environment is in a darkened grading suite on a full spec HDR monitor, the highlight level that you're currently looking at is a bit like waking up first thing in the morning and shining your phone in your eyes to see what time it is. It's an incredibly visceral experience. And that's when I first started to grade the imagery, that's what I responded to most. This is shot on a sound stage, as is this. Both instances, the sun is simply a 20K hanging from the roof of the sound stage. In the full HDR version, you can see the lines of the Fresnel lens of the 20K, and so there's a bit of colorist hijinks to smudge those things. What I found most interesting is when being very aggressive with your exposure range by pushing a very, very bright highlight and a very deep black in the same image. You got a viewing experience that was far more immersive than simply presenting a Rec 709 version, and that's the way that I would like to sort of approach grading HDR in the future. Is a film like McCabe and Mrs. Miller in the HDR world will still be desaturated and softly toned. But if you would like to, expose a mouse sitting inside a black tin can in the desert and also retain the sunspots in the sun, then you'll be able to do so. So what I think we now need to do, embracing high dynamic range broadcast, is push our camera manufacturers to produce sensors and film stocks that are capable of rendering 20 stops of dynamic range, 25 stops of dynamic range, because only then can we really be experiencing the full use of the sensor. At the moment, you shooting with any camera, digital camera or any film stock, the highlight roll off and the shadow crushing are basically the two places that I as a cinematographer sort of exist in, and the middle bit's just sort of someone's face. It doesn't really tell you atmospherically about an environment or move you emotionally, and so it's the top end and the bottom end that I really care about. And high dynamics range really allows you to explore those places. So it's Gordon Willis in high dynamic range. Now that's the thing. That's my experience. I still think it's what I'd love to see is the technology drive. I've seen the technology drive in the last few years move from 2K to 4K, and all of the various post houses having to upgrade their Da Vincis and upgrade their hard drive suites to have the firepower to deal with everything. And in the next year or so, we're going to see everybody move to much better monitoring. Hopefully, Dolby can help with all of that sort of stuff. And then the next push is how do we creatively deal with the pitfalls of seeing this extra color coming from the Rec 2020, but also how we deal with the creatively telling stories in this with these extra tools at our disposal, kind of thing. What I'd love also is for producers to start embracing the fact that that working, I guess it's a bit like working in HD or in 4K, working in 720p for a YouTube clip and then upgrading the resolution to 4K and expecting your grades to match and the shapes to not be noticeable and all that sort of stuff. What we need to be doing is working at the absolute optimum range that we can project we're going to be broadcasting in the future. So when we're grading, when we do our week's worth of grading, it's at, conceivably high dynamic range in Rec 2020 at 8K, and then the vendors that are broadcasting the material then downscale accordingly. But at the moment, there's particularly with certain co-productions, there's a tendency. Thomas graded a show that I made for the BBC called Hard Sun. There's a tendency for a lead co-producer to demand that you work within one colour space for their deliverables, and for another vendor to then have to fill in the gap. So on Hard Sun, we had a 6-day grade for the SDR version, and then Thomas filled in the blanks without me on the HDR version almost as an afterthought. But now it needs to be, cinematographers need to take the lead and demand that HDR is the core basis of the work, basically. So that's, I think, HDR in a nutshell. And what I'd really love is some questions from you guys, because it's really, really nerdy stuff, this HDR business, but it can be a lot of fun.
It is going to be exciting. I mean, we sort of can put a negative edge on it, but actually the images are breathtaking. The London skies, not so much. What we noticed on Fleabag is when it's overcast, you find that reflections are brighter than the cloud, and that's a bit like, oh, it's grey. So, maybe we all need to go to Los Angeles, because when the blue skies are out, and it looks fantastic. So that's the only thing. Overcast is a bit miserable at HDR, but them's the breaks of living here.
This may be a ridiculously stupid question, but I'm a humble film producer rather than a technologist. All you guys have been talking about doing an SDR version and an HDR version for TV deliverables. By definition, is cinema HDR?
No,
it's not.
So are we looking at doing an HDR and an SDR version for cinema?
So Ian, this is probably one for your projector.
Outside of Dolby Atmos's limited number of screens throughout the world, just joking.
So, the only true HDR cinema right now is let's say a premium cinema brand called Dolby Cinema. As you say, there are limited numbers of them around the world. That is a laser projector. It's using the same PQ scaling as you're seeing here for the home version, but because of the, let's say, very controlled environment, i.e. it's a dark environment, it's nowhere near as bright as this. For shows that we have done as a theatrical grade first, up to a home delivery, again, the kind of stylization works. You're just fitting it into a bigger range. And we've also done them from a home version first and brought them back down to a theatrical grade very, very quickly and efficiently. To give you a view, Baby Driver, the theatrical grade from an HDR home version was probably done in 4 hours. So once you have the kind of look and feel and what's possible, it can be a very, very quick translation.
I guess my question was, is it only the Dolby Vision systems that HDR matters out in the cinema world?
Right now, the contrast ratio that you can get off most systems is very, very limited. So a DCI grade is, I think, maximum about 2,000 to 1 contrast ratio. I think the best laser is about 8,000 to 1. Our contrast ratio is getting close to 1,000,000 to 1. So there's a big difference. DPs that come in and see their images in Dolby Cinema, just kind of, it's like fantastic. Now I've got a chance to see blacks and highlights theatrically.
Okay, so I think there's some waving going on to there. So unfortunately, that brings it to a close rather abruptly. Sorry about the lack of questions, but hopefully, we'll all be around the show for the rest of the day. So please feel free to grab one of us and thank you very much for coming. Cheers.